I'm Susan Charnley, and I'm a research social scientist with the Forest Service. I'm based at the Pacific Northwest Research Station in Portland, Oregon. So thank you for including me in the Colorado Beaver Summit. It's great to be here. I haven't had an opportunity to work in Colorado previously, but it's been great to get a perspective from across the Western states on beaver restoration and what's going on and what some of the shared challenges and solutions are. What I want to talk about in my presentation today is really the social considerations associated with doing beaver-related restoration projects. I think in general, when we do ecological restoration work, we don't often give the social aspect of that work due attention, but I'm going to argue today that that's really important, and I want to share with you what we've learned about some social factors that I think are important for creating a supportive environment for doing this kind of restoration work. So if you want to go to the next slide, Jackie. I undertook research between about 2015 and 2020 as part of a larger project and an interdisciplinary team effort that really aimed to better understand process-based stream restoration using beavers and artificial beaver dams, and the impacts of doing beaver-related restoration on hydrology, on riparian vegetation, and in our case on people. And the conditions under which it's most likely to produce the desired outcomes. So although I'm just going to talk about the social component of this broader effort, I do want to acknowledge my collaborators and my funder, which was the Northwest Climate Hub. So to the next slide. As we've heard already during this conference, there's basically three main types of beaver-related restoration, and those include beaver translocation, artificial beaver dams, and those come in many varieties, and what I call riparian revegetation, which basically occurs when people undertake management activities to restore riparian vegetation and sometimes even intentionally plant foods that beavers like. And then that restoration effort sort of causes beaver to recolonize those areas, or perhaps beaver then translocated to those areas. So these different types are certainly not mutually exclusive. What I'm going to focus on today are artificial beaver dams and riparian revegetation. I didn't do research on beaver translocation, but I was happy to hear that Corey Mosby talked about that at length this morning. And I think a lot of the principles that I present today certainly apply to the context of translocation as well. So if we go to the next slide, the first thing that we did as part of our interdisciplinary team effort was to try and undertake an inventory of beaver-related restoration projects in rangelands in the Western states. And our research specifically focused on rangeland environments because I think beaver restoration and its water-related benefits are so important in these arid and semi-arid parts of the West. And so what we found was that beaver-related restoration really started taking off around 2005, and most of these projects have happened over the last 15 years or so. And what you see there in black are translocation projects. Those are by far the most common types of projects, although I think riparian revegetation, because it can be a sort of a more passive approach, is often underreported. It's unfortunate that our data only go up to 2016, because I think if we looked at the last 5 years, we would see extreme growth in these projects and a lot more of the projects that involve artificial beaver dams. But anyway, they're on the increase. And if you go to the next slide, Jackie, I think that means that social considerations are particularly important given this rise in popularity. And so why is it important to consider the social aspect of beaver-related restoration? Well, three reasons that I want to emphasize here. First, there's a lot of geographic overlap between where people like to live, where beaver habitat occurs, and where beaver like to live. All of these, beavers and people like low-lying areas that tend to be near water and have relatively low gradient streams. And, so if people see beaver as more of a nuisance or than an asset, then that's going to influence how they're managed and how well people and beaver are going to coexist. Second of all, if we think about where we do beaver-related restoration projects, well, we either do it on private lands, And that means those landowners have to be supportive and they have to agree to it, or else we do it on public lands, as we just heard about from Ashley. And in that case, we need the public to be supportive of these efforts too. And we have to have compatible land use activities, such as grazing on public lands, for example, that goes along with beaver-related restoration. So we have to figure out how we can get people on board with this approach. And then finally, I think we can have really well-designed beaver restoration projects from a biophysical standpoint. But if we have, excessive costs, or we have regulatory barriers, if landowners don't want these projects on their properties, or if there's not social support, no matter how well designed the projects are, they're just not going to be able to be implemented. So it's important to understand social context. All right, to the next slide. So one of the other first things that we did as part of our research was we did a literature research on people's perceptions of beavers and beaver dams. And what we found from looking at this literature, studies that have been done mainly in the United States, we found that there's basically two things that happen when beavers colonize an area and they start to build dams, and we start to see the environmental change that is associated with dam building. On the lower trajectory, I would say people see both positive benefits of beavers and they also see drawbacks. And the bottom trajectory is one in which those drawbacks outweigh the benefits. And so tolerance of beavers declines and people take actions to remove or discourage beavers and their dams. And that's not what we want if we want to favor beaver-related restoration, right? So on the positive side, if people see the benefits of beavers and dams outweighing their drawbacks, then tolerance will increase and actions will hopefully be taken to encourage those beavers and their dam building activities. And what we found was that, whether the benefits outweigh the drawbacks or vice versa, is often related to, who you are, where you live, and how you make a living, right? So if you're a farmer and you do irrigated crop production and beavers are in the neighborhood, you may just see them as a nuisance animal because they're clogging up your irrigation infrastructure. But if you're a rancher in Western rangelands, we found that often, and as we have heard from a couple of ranchers yesterday, people really say that the benefits outweigh the drawbacks. And so it creates a favorable atmosphere for restoration projects. So if we go to the next slide, the social science research we did then was really focused in on how can we get to that upward trajectory and create a more positive social environment for beaver-related restoration. And the work that we did identified 6 basic principles that I want to highlight today. So next slide, please. The research methods we used, we did sort of in-depth studies of 6 different projects in Western rangelands. 3 involved the use of beaver dam analogs. That was the project in California, and 2 of the projects in Oregon that you can see with the dots there on the map. One of them involved low-rise rock dams as a restoration tool. That was a 3rd project in Oregon. One involved riparian revegetation with natural colonization by beavers, and that was in Elko County, Nevada. And then we looked at Owyhee County in Idaho, where they were considering doing beaver dam analogs. I think it was the Department of Fish and Wildlife there that was thinking about it. And so we kind of surveyed ranchers on how they felt about this prospective intervention. So we interviewed, that was our main technique, over 100 people, about half of whom were ranchers, and then the other half of whom were either working for agencies that were involved in these efforts or working for non-governmental organizations involved as well. So we summarized the results of what we found in these case studies, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. So next slide. To the next slide, Jackie. Great. Oops, there we go. Okay, so the first principle, which I've already talked a bit about, is that people are more likely to support beaver-related restoration when they perceive that the benefits outweigh the drawbacks. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the benefits and drawbacks that ranchers told us about in our interviews. So if we go to the next slide. So this was one of the main benefits that ranchers identified, and they had to do with water. And we heard Jay and Dallas talk about this yesterday. You know, they saw that beavers really helped to increase and raise the groundwater levels in the surrounding areas, and they saw improved stream flows with more quantity of water in streams, as well as a longer duration of stream flows into the hot season. And they saw increased water ponding. And so basically, these beaver projects had increased the availability of water on the landscape, and that was certainly favorable for livestock. Next slide, please. They also identified that beaver dams will help to aggregate incised streams and reconnect those streams to the floodplains. You can see on the left that you have dry sagebrush going right up to the stream bank, that very incised stream. And then on the right, as you start to reconnect the stream to the floodplain, that sagebrush recedes and you start to get more green and wetter riparian vegetation. Next slide. As a result of that increasing hydration of riparian areas, you get more forage production. And so people saw that there was an increase in the extent of riparian pastures and wet meadows. And this translated, and along with the higher water table, that helped to grow a higher quantity of forage for livestock in those riparian pastures. And it was better quality forage because it stayed green longer. And that translated into favorable weight gains for livestock and improved livestock health. Next slide, please. They also identified benefits for fish and wildlife, of course, by improving aquatic and riparian habitat. Many of these species, such as salmonids and bull trout, are on the endangered species list. And so there were positive benefits for these species. Next slide, please. And some of this translated into financial benefits for ranchers. When you have a higher groundwater table, there's less need to use water developments to water your livestock. It provided more natural irrigation for hay. So they had to run their wells and pump irrigation water less. Some ranchers had even, started growing less hay during the summer because they were getting so much more natural grass growing. And then when you have healthier, fatter cattle, you get higher prices when you go to sell those cattle. And on top of all that, it's a relatively low cost restoration technique. So the next slide. Drawbacks in their views, almost all of the ranchers we talked to do grow hay in the summertime, and they did report that beavers were plugging those irrigation canals. They also sometimes caused flooding of pastures and hay fields, and sometimes roads were flooded and washed out. They said, those dams and the associated wetlands can make it harder for cattle to cross streams. Sometimes you had to move them a lot further upstream or whatever to help them cross. They would also cut down trees that beaver like. And one person, had an experience where an artificial beaver dam had blown out, and he believed that caused some property damage for him. So there were some drawbacks, but if we go to the next slide, I would say overall, most ranchers said that the benefits by far outweighed the drawbacks. And, here's just a couple of quotes. You can have some issues with those beaver as far as moving the channel around and whatnot, but they sure helped us out on the range. And another rancher said, there are places that have turned back to wetlands and we can't graze them. So we've given up an acre that's now swamp, but we've gained 6 acres that are good pasture that weren't before. So again, you're going to have pluses and minuses, but you want to try and increase the pluses. And if we go to the next slide, this is on this theme. One way of improving this ratio of benefits to drawbacks is to use some of these techniques that we heard about at length this morning from Aaron, that can be used to mitigate the negative impacts of beaver on people. And so I'm not going to say more about this here because we did hear about it at length from Aaron, but certainly people were, some ranchers had adopted, these flow devices, or they were fencing trees, etc. And that really helped to mitigate the negative impacts of these projects. And, this actually was a ranch that, they did a demonstration site of what some of these tools are, and they had different groups of ranchers from the area come in and look at it. And so I think having these demonstration sites that other ranchers can learn from about how to mitigate these negative impacts was extremely helpful, because you need a lot of outreach and education to make people aware of these tools. So the next slide, please. The third principle is that you have to have land use practices that are compatible with beaver-related restoration. And that can sometimes mean adapting grazing management in riparian areas. As we know, cattle like to use riparian areas for water, for forage, for shade. And if that grazing is unmanaged in those areas, it can have a negative impact on both stream morphology as well as riparian vegetation. And that can mean that the habitat is not conducive for beaver. And so the two different strategies we saw ranchers use in our projects were just, outright fencing some of those riparian areas to keep livestock out of them. That caused positive changes in riparian vegetation that then were conducive to beaver moving into the area. And then the second strategy was, you don't need fencing, but you just need conservation-oriented grazing management. And so, for example, ranchers would keep their livestock out of those riparian zones during the hottest summer months and just graze there in the spring and in the late fall. And those brought about favorable vegetation changes that were conducive to beaver reoccupying the landscape. So again, you just need to come up with some of these compatible grazing management practices. And some of these techniques actually were put in not specifically for beaver, but for fish concerns, but they had the positive benefit of favoring beaver habitat. So the next one, we've talked about this today some, harvest pressure on beaver. And we do know that there are a number of factors that affect beaver populations. That includes habitat availability, predation, and disease. High harvest pressure on beavers can limit their ability to live in restoration sites and build dams. Now, we did not find this to be a concern in any of our 6 case studies. Nobody reported that high harvest pressure was a limiting factor. If you look at the data that we gathered here from agencies about beaver harvesting, licensed beaver harvesting in these 4 states, you can see that over the last 20 to 30 years, it's really, it's gone down in each state. And again, I think we've talked a bit about, this could be associated with low prices for beaver pelts, but nevertheless, there were some places where we worked where there were closures on beaver harvesting and at restoration sites that may have had a favorable impact. In Oregon here, there is legislation on the table to close federal lands to beaver harvesting. That hasn't yet been voted on, and we heard yesterday New Mexico has taken this step. So it may be appropriate in certain locations to try and take a look at how to manage harvest of beavers. But again, we didn't find this to be an issue where we worked. Okay. Excuse me, the 5th principle. Beaver-related restoration calls for a regulatory environment that really enables experimentation and flexibility and adaptive management. This is, as I showed in my early slide, it's a relatively recent approach to stream restoration. And it's a nature-based restoration approach, right? We're relying on a beaver. Beaver behavior could be somewhat unpredictable. We're also relying on stream environments, which are dynamic. They fluctuate, they change over time. And so it's hard to be sure, that you're going to get the outcomes that you're looking for, right? I mean, we hope for the best, we do the best we can, but, we have to see that we put in structures, we make interventions, beaver come, and then what are the impacts both environmentally and socially, and how do we adapt and adjust to those over time and respond with appropriate interventions. So we may need to experiment. It might work well in one place, but it has to be adapted a little bit to a different location. So we need to experiment to develop best practices in particular places. And there needs to be adaptive management so that we can respond to changes over time and make sure restoration is going in the right direction. But that can be challenging because we have regulations that oftentimes aren't that flexible. And in fact, in the 4 case study sites where we worked that involved the use of artificial beaver dams, these regulatory restrictions, trying to get permits for doing in-stream structures, those were the biggest barrier, the biggest challenge for beaver-related restoration, especially, for example, in California, where it was a very new approach and the regulatory agencies hadn't had to deal with it before. If we go to the next slide, one of the key concerns is impacts on fish. This came up in both California and in Oregon in particular. There's debates about, well, as we've talked about today already, beaver and fish co-evolved in these streams for thousands of years. Putting in these artificial structures is not going to be a problem. And in fact, there is research to indicate that these restoration techniques often have positive impacts on fish populations, but there's a lot of concern, especially where you're doing this restoration in streams that have Endangered Species Act listed fish. Regulatory agencies are concerned about having negative impacts on critical habitat for these listed species. So they can be very cautious, and it just takes, working together over time. But I think what really helps is additional research and monitoring, because the more data that we have at these specific sites where we're doing these projects, then the better informed the regulatory process can be. To the next slide, and our last principle here. I think that it's critical to have proponents, to have landowners that are willing to do these projects on their property, and to have partners that are involved in these projects. And these people have to be willing to innovate and take some risks, because we can't assure what the outcomes are going to be, and be flexible with the way that the stream environment responds to restoration attempts. And then people, need to stay committed over the long term. Beaver-related restoration is not a one-time intervention. It's a process, and it's a process that unfolds over time. So people need to stay committed. And I would say in all of the projects that we talked about, and I would say a lot of the talks we've heard at this summit, we've had those people here who are the ones that are willing to take the lead and try and make a difference and make these projects happen and stay committed over time. And then the partners that can bring in capacity, whether it's financial or technical assistance or what have you, those partnerships are really critical for success. Next slide. So to wrap up then, I just want to summarize, here are the 6 considerations for BRR from a social standpoint that I've talked about today. I think all of these things are really important. And if we go to the next slide, I think, if we consider the social aspects of beaver-related restoration, we can't promise that they're going to produce their desired outcomes. But I think if we take the social side of things into account, we'll get better designed projects, and that will increase the likelihood of successful implementation, which in turn will increase the potential for success of these projects. So last slide. Thank you. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more about what I've talked about today, here are a couple of products that present our research findings. There's an article in Rangeland Ecology and Management that goes into more depth about what I've talked about today. Underneath that, there's a story map that the Northwest Climate Hub did based on this research, and it's pretty cool. So there's a web address there. And then we did do reports for, I think it was 5 of the specific projects that go much more into depth. This is just a photo of one of them on the right here, but those are available through the Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station website. And so, thanks very much for having me.